The German pilot's hands were steady on the controls. His phantom jet sliced through the alpine air at 600 knots, the autumn sun glinting off the cockpit canopy. Behind him, his weapons officer checked their position against the navigation chart. They were on course. They were safe. They were over Bavaria. They were wrong. Without warning, two delta-winged shadows materialized on either side of the cockpit so close the German pilot could see the Swiss crosses, could read the stenciling on the interceptor pilot's helmet, could see the calm, professional expression behind the visor. The Swiss pilot raised his hand. The gesture was unmistakable. "Follow me now." The intercept had taken 4 minutes. The Germans hadn't even known they'd crossed the border. This is the story of how it happened. How a neutral nation, smaller than West Virginia, built an air defense system that could humble the most powerful air forces on Earth. How Swiss Mirage III pilots became legends by doing the impossible every single day of the Cold War. October 1961, Soviet tanks rolled into position at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. American tanks faced them across a concrete barrier, still wet from construction. For 16 hours, the world's two superpowers stared at each other down the barrels of their guns. One nervous finger on one trigger could have started World War III, 300 miles south, in the narrow valleys of the Swiss Alps. Mirage pilots sat in their cockpits, engines idling, waiting for orders that they prayed would never come. Switzerland sat exactly where no nation wanted to be during the Cold War, in the middle. To the west, NATO stretched from Norway to Turkey, bristling with American nuclear weapons and thousands of combat aircraft. To the east, the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact maintained armies capable of sweeping across Central Europe within days. And there, occupying some of the most strategically valuable terrain on the continent, sat Switzerland. The Alpine passes cutting through Swiss territory had been vital military corridors since Hannibal crossed them with elephants in 218 BC. Napoleon had forced his Grande Armée through them. Now, in the nuclear age, those same passes represented potential invasion routes that both superpowers might be tempted to exploit if war came. The shortest path from Soviet bases to American installations ran straight through Switzerland. The Swiss understood this with crystalline clarity. Their response was not to pick a side. Their response was to make violating Swiss territory so costly that neither side would dare try. Switzerland had maintained its neutrality since 1815, when the Congress of Vienna formally recognized its unique status following the Napoleonic Wars. That neutrality had survived 2 world wars. But the Cold War presented challenges unlike anything in history. Both superpowers possessed weapons that could annihilate cities in minutes. Aircraft could fly at twice the speed of sound. Missiles could strike targets hundreds of kilometers away without warning. The Swiss answer was a concept called armed neutrality, a philosophy so deeply ingrained in Swiss national identity that it shaped every aspect of their society. They would not align with either bloc, but they would fight ferociously against anyone who violated their borders. The Swiss militia system was unique in Europe, perhaps in the world. Unlike professional armies that maintained large standing forces, Switzerland relied on a citizen army where virtually every able-bodied male underwent military training and remained a reservist for decades. These men kept their weapons at home, the famous Swiss practice that continues to this day, ready to mobilize within hours if called upon. The system meant that Switzerland could field a force of hundreds of thousands within days, a remarkable capability for a nation of only a few million people. Every Swiss man was a soldier, trained from his teenage years in the use of weapons. At age 20, he entered recruit school for basic training. After that, he returned to civilian life but remained in the reserves, keeping his military rifle, typically the distinctive SIG SG-550, locked in his home. Each year he reported for refresher training, maintaining his skills throughout his service obligation that extended into his 40s or even 50s. This created a population that was inherently militarized, where defense was not the responsibility of a distant professional class, but a personal obligation shared by every citizen. The entire country was honeycombed with bunkers and fortifications, many built into the mountains themselves. By some estimates, Switzerland had bunker space for its entire population in the event of nuclear war. Artillery pieces were hidden in tunnels with camouflaged doors that could be opened in minutes. Underground hospitals were carved into solid rock, capable of treating thousands of casualties while protected from nuclear blast and fallout. Bridges were pre-wired with explosives, ready to be demolished at a moment's notice to slow any invader. Mountain passes could be sealed with pre-positioned explosives and rock slides triggered by demolition charges. This concept of the national redoubt meant that even if an enemy overran the lowland areas, Swiss forces could retreat into the Alps and continue fighting indefinitely from prepared positions. Any invader would face not just an army, but an entire nation in arms. Fighting on terrain they knew intimately, supplied from stockpiles hidden in hundreds of mountain locations. The Swiss took this seriously in ways that sometimes seemed extreme to outside observers. During the Cold War, civil defense drills were regular occurrences. Sirens would wail, and citizens would report to their designated shelters. Supplies of food, medicine, and ammunition were stockpiled in quantities sufficient for years of warfare. The Swiss government maintained grain reserves, fuel reserves, even reserves of coffee because Swiss national morale was considered essential to defense, and Swiss national morale required coffee. But the most visible expression of Swiss determination, the sharpest edge of their defensive capability, was the Swiss Air Force, the Schweizer Luftwaffe. And by the early 1960s, the heart of that Air Force was the magnificent Dassault Mirage III. The Mirage III looked like speed itself, delta-winged predator that seemed to slice through the air even when standing still. Its designer, Marcel Dassault, understood better than most what freedom cost and how it had to be defended. Born Marcel Bloch, he had been a successful aircraft designer before World War II. When the Germans occupied France, they demanded he work for them. He refused. The Nazis deported him to Buchenwald concentration camp, where he somehow survived conditions designed to kill. After the war, he changed his name to Dassault, derived from the resistance code name his brother had used, and rebuilt his company from the ruins. The aircraft he created afterward carried the determination of a man who had seen the worst of tyranny and resolved to give free nations the tools to resist it. The Mirage III was one of those tools. Its distinctive delta wing provided exceptional performance at high altitude and supersonic speed. The Snecma ATAR turbojet engine could push the aircraft past Mach 2 more than twice the speed of sound. For its era, it was among the most capable interceptors in the world. It's designed to climb rapidly and destroy enemy bombers before they could deliver their nuclear payloads. The French Air Force began operating the Mirage III in 1961. Within months, countries around the world were clamoring to acquire this remarkable aircraft. Israel purchased Mirages and used them to devastating effect in the Six-Day War of 1967, achieving extraordinary kill ratios against Soviet-equipped Arab air forces. Australia bought them to defend their vast territories. South Africa, Pakistan, Argentina, dozens of nations followed. But perhaps no country adapted the Mirage III to its particular needs as brilliantly as Switzerland. The Swiss evaluation process was characteristically thorough, spanning several years and involving exhaustive testing of every available option. They examined the American Lockheed F-104 Starfighter Sleek, a pencil-shaped interceptor capable of Mach 2 that had earned the grim nickname Widowmaker for its high accident rate, particularly in the German Luftwaffe, where it killed dozens of pilots. The F-104 was fast but unforgiving, with aerodynamic characteristics that left little room for pilot error. In the Swiss Alps, where margin for error was already minimal, it was simply too dangerous. They considered the Convair F-106 Delta Dart, an advanced American interceptor that represented the state-of-the-art in all-weather interception. It was an excellent aircraft, but too complex and expensive for Swiss needs. Designed for the vast airspace of North America rather than the confined spaces of alpine valleys, they examined the English Electric Lightning, a British interceptor with exceptional climb performance, but its range was limited and its twin engines consumed fuel at prodigious rates. They looked at the Saab J-35 Drakon from Sweden, another nation that understood the requirements of neutrality. The Drakon was an innovative design with a distinctive double delta wing. But ultimately, the Swedish aircraft couldn't quite match the Mirage's combination of performance and reliability. The evaluation went far beyond specifications on paper. Swiss test pilots flew each candidate aircraft extensively in the Alps themselves. Not in ideal conditions at low altitude on sunny days, but in the challenging environment where the aircraft would actually operate. They flew through narrow valleys where one wrong move meant death against granite walls. They flew in the turbulent winds that swirled unpredictably around mountain peaks. They tested takeoffs and landings on the short runways carved into Swiss mountainsides, some of which had gradients that would terrify civilian pilots. They flew in winter storms and summer turbulence, in darkness and in conditions of poor visibility. Each aircraft was evaluated on dozens of criteria: acceleration, climb rate, turn performance, stability at low speeds, behavior at high altitude, ease of maintenance, spare parts availability, cockpit visibility, weapon systems compatibility, and radar performance in mountainous terrain. Swiss engineers examined every system, questioning manufacturers about reliability data and maintenance requirements. Swiss mechanics worked on the aircraft to understand maintenance complexity. The Mirage III emerged as the clear winner. It offered the best combination of performance, reliability, and suitability for mountain operations. The Delta Wing provided excellent high-speed performance, while also giving reasonable low-speed handling. The single ATAR engine was powerful and relatively reliable. The aircraft systems were sophisticated enough to be effective, but not so complex that they would be difficult to maintain. Perhaps most importantly, the Mirage just felt right to Swiss pilots flying in the Alps. It seemed designed for the kind of operations Switzerland would require. Switzerland eventually acquired two variants: the Mirage III single-seat interceptor optimized for air defense missions, and the Mirage IIRS reconnaissance version equipped with cameras and sensors. In total, they would acquire 57 Mirage IIS interceptors and 18 Mirage IIRS reconnaissance aircraft, a substantial investment for a small nation, but one deemed essential for maintaining credible air defense. Both variants were extensively modified for Swiss requirements in ways that went far beyond simple customization. Swiss engineers installed reinforced landing gear to handle the demanding conditions of mountain airfields, some of which had slopes that subjected the gear to unusual stress during landing and takeoff. They added specialized navigation equipment designed specifically for mountainous terrain, where conventional radio navigation could be confused or blocked by surrounding peaks. They upgraded the cockpit heating and pressurization systems to cope with the extreme temperatures encountered at high altitudes. Over the Alps, winter flights could see temperatures plunge to -40 degrees or colder. They modified the hydraulic systems to remain reliable in extreme cold, solving problems that had plagued Mirage operators in warmer climates. The Swiss even made aerodynamic modifications, adding small improvements to control surfaces based on their experience flying in mountain conditions. These modifications were so successful that some were eventually adopted by other Mirage operators, including France itself, a remarkable case of the student teaching the teacher. But what made the Swiss Mirage force truly exceptional wasn't the aircraft themselves, impressive as they were. It was how the Swiss operated them. From the very beginning, the Swiss Air Force fixated on one metric above all others: reaction time. The geography made this obsession inevitable. Switzerland is roughly 400 kilometers from east to west, and only 200 kilometers from north to south at its widest point. An enemy aircraft traveling at subsonic speeds could cross the entire country in less than 30 minutes. At Mach 2, the crossing time was measured in minutes. An enemy bomber could penetrate Swiss airspace, deliver its weapons, and escape before a leisurely response could even get airborne. The Swiss had to be faster than that, much faster. They built what became one of the most remarkable quick reaction alert systems ever developed. Mirage pilots sat on cockpit alert, strapped into their aircraft, engines ready for immediate start. Ground crews refined their procedures until every movement was optimized, every second accounted for. The goal was audacious: from scramble order to 10,000 feet altitude in under 4 minutes. Most NATO air forces of the era required 15 to 20 minutes to achieve the same result. The Swiss did it in less than 240 seconds. Every time. The procedure was a marvel of Swiss precision. Pilots sat in their cockpits with everything prepared for immediate launch. Helmets connected, oxygen flowing, fingers resting on the switches that would bring the ATAR engine to life. When the scramble order came transmitted from radar stations built into mountain peaks themselves, conscious thought was barely required. The startup sequence had been rehearsed so many times that it became automatic, hands moving through the switches with the fluid precision of a concert pianist playing scales. The ATAR engine ignited with a sound like controlled thunder. Hydraulics, wind. The aircraft trembled, eager. 47 seconds from cold engine to combat ready, The pilot released brakes, pushed the throttle forward into afterburner, and the Mirage rocketed down the runway. Rotation, liftoff, gear up. Nose pitched skyward at an angle that would have terrified civilian pilots. The Mirage climbed at over 15,000 feet per minute, the pilot pulling multiple Gs, the mountain peaks flashing past the canopy. 3 minutes, 51 seconds after the scramble order, combat altitude achieved. Eyes scanning the sky, radar locked on target, ready to intercept. Ground crews were equally essential to this standard. These men and women worked in all-weather freezing winter storms. Summer heat that baked the tarmac, keeping the aircraft in constant readiness. When a scramble was called, they cleared the aircraft with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no confusion, no delay. They tracked 2,847 components per aircraft. They logged every flight hour, replaced parts according to schedules that left nothing to chance. One Swiss Mirage flew 4,200 hours without a single unscheduled maintenance action. This wasn't luck. This was Switzerland. But the real secret of Swiss air defense wasn't just the aircraft or the procedures. It was the pilots themselves and what the mountains had made them. Switzerland was too small to train pilots domestically in their early careers. They learned basic flying skills at bases in France, the United States, and other allied countries, attending flight schools alongside NATO pilots. But it was in Switzerland, flying through the Alpine valleys, that they developed abilities that seemed almost supernatural to pilots from flattered countries. To fly the Alps was to dance with death. Valleys barely wider than the Mirage's wingspan. Granite walls rising thousands of meters, unforgiving and immutable. Weather that could change in minutes, fog rolling in without warning, thunderstorms building with terrifying speed, winds swirling around peaks that could flip an aircraft inverted without notice, and always the mountains themselves, waiting to destroy any pilot who made even a small error. Swiss pilots flew these valleys day after day, year after year, in all seasons and all conditions. They flew in summer heat and winter blizzards. They practiced low-level navigation through passages so narrow their wingtips seemed to brush the rocks. They learned to read mountain weather, to anticipate the treacherous downdrafts lurking on the lee sides of peaks, to find their way through clouds so thick that instruments were the only guide. The winter training was particularly demanding. Snow covered the landscape for months, making visual navigation more difficult. Ice could form on aircraft surfaces at certain altitudes and temperatures. The short winter days meant much training was conducted in darkness or twilight, yet the Swiss trained through it all, knowing that an attack could come in any season, at any hour. They learned techniques taught nowhere else in the world. How to use valleys to mask their approach from radar. How to read terrain features and anticipate where updrafts and downdrafts would occur. How to appear suddenly from behind a ridge and surprise an intruder who thought he was safe. They became masters of their environment in ways that pilots from other countries could scarcely imagine. Lieutenant Hans Müller, a composite of many Swiss pilots, completed his 1,000th Alpine sortie on a February morning in 1978. His flight leader asked him afterward if it ever got easier. Flying valleys so narrow you could read the frost patterns on the granite walls. Müller thought for a moment. No, he said finally, but you learn to trust yourself. You learn that fear is your friend. It keeps you alive. The day you're not afraid is the day the mountains will kill you. This mastery gave Swiss pilots an enormous advantage when intercepting intruders. An enemy pilot who strayed into Swiss airspace found himself in terrain that the Swiss knew intimately, terrain that he was struggling just to navigate safely. The intruder would be fighting just to maintain spatial awareness, while the Swiss pilot, completely comfortable in his mountain domain, could focus entirely on the intercept. It was home court advantage magnified to an extreme that few other military forces could claim. The Swiss also developed sophisticated ground control systems to direct their interceptors. Radar stations positioned on mountain peaks often built into the rock itself. Protected from attack and hardened against nuclear blast effects, provided coverage of all approaches to Swiss airspace. Controllers trained specifically for the mountain environment could guide aircraft through valleys and around. Terrain features with extraordinary precision. The radar network was a marvel of Cold War engineering. Swiss placed stations at the highest possible elevations, giving them excellent coverage of surrounding airspace. They built redundancy into the system so that losing any single station wouldn't blind the network. They connected stations with hardened communications links designed to survive attack, and they trained controllers to work under every conceivable condition. The entire system functioned as an integrated whole: pilots, controllers, ground crews, working together with the precision of a Swiss watch, which, in a sense, it was. Throughout the Cold War, Swiss Mirage pilots scrambled thousands of times to intercept aircraft that strayed into their airspace. Most incursions were inadvertent. Navigation technology in the 1960s and 70s was far less precise than today. Pilots got lost, navigators made errors, crews were blown off course by unexpected winds, maps were misread, radio beacons were misidentified, compass errors accumulated over long flights. A crew that thought they were safely over Germany or France might discover too late that they had crossed into Swiss territory. But inadvertent or not, the Swiss treated every violation identically. They responded with overwhelming force and absolute professionalism. The typical intercept began with radar detection. Swiss ground controllers tracked the incoming aircraft and determined it was approaching or crossing the border. The scramble order went out to pilots already strapped in and ready. Afterburners screamed. The Mirage climbed at maximum rate, the pilot pulling multiple Gs as he rocketed toward his quarry. Within minutes, usually less than 4, the Mirage would be on the Intruder. The Swiss pilot approached from the rear quarter, slightly offset from directly behind. This position allowed him to see the Intruder clearly while remaining in a weapons employment zone. If the Intruder proved hostile, he was ready to respond. Then came the critical moment. The Swiss pilot throttled back, matched the Intruder's speed, and slid alongside close enough to see the other pilot's eyes widen in shock. Close enough to read the aircraft's markings. Close enough that there could be no doubt about what was happening. No radio call was necessary. The message was clear. You have made a mistake. Follow me now. The visual impact was considerable. The Mirage's delta wing gave it a distinctive, almost predatory appearance. The engine intake beneath the nose resembled the maw of some mechanical beast. And when a Swiss pilot brought his Mirage that close enough to see rivets in the fuselage, close enough to make eye contact, the experience was unforgettable. Part of what made these encounters so startling was the sheer competence of the Swiss pilots. They flew with surgical precision, maintaining exact position relative to the Intruder while navigating through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Their aircraft were always in perfect condition, maintained to standards that exceeded any other air force, and their demeanor visible through the cockpit glass was utterly calm and utterly serious. Most Intruders complied immediately. The Swiss would escort them to the nearest airfield, usually Dubendorf, near Zurich, where diplomatic procedures took over. Crews were questioned politely but thoroughly. Aircraft were inspected. Protests were lodged through official channels, depending on circumstances. Penalties ranged from stern warnings to substantial fines. The Swiss took violations very seriously, but they were always correct, always professional. This wasn't personal. This was Swiss sovereignty, being defended according to Swiss law. One incident from 1973 became legendary within Luftwaffe circles. A flight of Phantom jets on a training mission drifted across the Swiss border near Lake Constance. The error was perhaps 3 kilometers, lasting only a couple of minutes. The German pilots barely registered that something might be wrong, then 2 Mirage IIs suddenly appeared alongside them. The German flight leader later described the moment in a classified debriefing. We hadn't even confirmed our position when they were there. I looked right, and there's this delta-winged fighter maybe 10 meters from my canopy. I could see the Swiss pilot. He looked at me, completely calm, and pointed down. The message was clear. The intercept had taken 3 minutes. 48 seconds from the moment Swiss radar detected the border violation. The Swiss escorted the Phantoms to Dubendorf. The German crews spent an uncomfortable few hours in a debriefing room, explaining their navigation error to polite but firm Swiss intelligence officers. Diplomatic notes were exchanged. Apologies were offered. The incident was eventually smoothed over, but the German pilots never forgot the lesson. We learned that day that the Swiss were not joking about their neutrality. One of them recalled years later. They would protect their airspace against any one friend or foe, and they had the capability to back up that determination. The Phantom is one of the most capable fighters ever built. We trained constantly. We were good. But the Swiss were operating on a different level entirely. The debriefing room conversation was telling. How? The German flight leader asked. We were barely across the border. How did you? The Swiss pilot smiled slightly. We practiced, but for minutes. 3 minutes, 51 seconds, the Swiss pilot corrected. We're working on making it faster. Similar incidents occurred with other NATO air forces. American pilots strayed into Swiss airspace and found themselves escorted by Mirages. Americans flew some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, but they were no more immune to Swiss interception than anyone else. French crews from the Armée de l'Air received exactly the same treatment. Despite close relations between the two countries, and the fact that the Mirage was a French design, the Swiss made no distinction based on alliance or friendship. A violation was a violation, regardless of who committed it. Perhaps even more remarkably, the Swiss also intercepted Warsaw Pact aircraft on several occasions during the Cold War. Soviet and Eastern Bloc aircraft sometimes strayed into Swiss airspace, whether through navigation error or deliberate probing of Western defenses. The Swiss response was identical. Scramble, intercept, escort. These Eastern Bloc incidents were politically sensitive and rarely publicized. Both sides had reasons to minimize publicity. Soviets didn't want to admit their aircraft had been intercepted. The Swiss didn't want to provoke either superpower. But the intercepts happened, carefully documented in Swiss records that remained classified for decades. They demonstrated that Swiss neutrality was genuine and impartial. Some Warsaw Pact violations may have been deliberate probes intelligence gathering to test Swiss reaction times and capabilities. If so, the Swiss response was certainly informative. Though the message received in Moscow was the same message received in Washington, Paris, and Bonn. Swiss airspace is defended. Do not test us. An American F-4 pilot who was intercepted in 1977 put it this way years later. I've flown combat missions in Vietnam, been shot at. I've seen SAMs coming up at me. But nothing prepared me for the feeling of having those Swiss Mirages just appear beside me in those narrow valleys. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something else. Respect. Maybe awe. They owned that sky. Swiss Mirage pilots developed a particular reputation among their European counterparts. They were known as the quiet professionals men who rarely boasted about their abilities, but whose skills were undeniable. At international exercises where Swiss pilots participated events were different. NATO nations sent squadrons to train together. They consistently impressed observers with their precision flying and tactical acumen. They followed procedures exactly, never cutting corners or taking unnecessary risks. This attention to detail was sometimes seen as rigid by more aggressive NATO pilots who valued improvisation and bending the rules, but it produced consistent results under all conditions. At one exercise in southern France in 1979, a Swiss Mirage pilot demonstrated low-level navigation through a simulated enemy radar network. He flew the entire route over 300 kilometers at altitudes below 100 meters. Following valleys and terrain features to avoid radar detection, he hit every timing checkpoint within 5 seconds of his planned time, navigating with map and stopwatch because GPS didn't exist yet. When he landed, experienced French and American pilots who had been observing admitted they'd never seen such precise flying. One American colonel commented, most pilots would have been happy to hit those checkpoints within a minute. This guy was hitting them within seconds, in an aircraft doing 500 knots, 50 meters above the ground. That's not piloting. That's art. Some of the best pilots in NATO admitted privately they wouldn't want to face the Swiss in a real confrontation. The combination of aircraft knowledge, terrain mastery, and disciplined procedures created adversaries who would be extraordinarily difficult to defeat in their home environment. A West German fighter pilot who flew exchange tours with several air forces in the 1980s later wrote that the Swiss were among the most professionally competent pilots he'd ever encountered. They weren't cocky. They weren't flashy. They were just supremely good at their jobs in ways that made everyone else look slightly amateurish by comparison. Part of this reputation stemmed from training intensity. While other air forces flew a certain number of hours per year, typically 80220, flying hours was standard for NATO fighter pilots. The Swiss packed those hours with demanding sorties that pushed pilots and aircraft to their limits. But more importantly, the quality of those hours was exceptional. Every sortie was planned meticulously. Every training mission had specific objectives that were debriefed thoroughly afterward. There was no such thing as just going flying in the Swiss Air Force. Every flight had purpose and intent. Low-level navigation through the Alps was standard fare, the kind of flying that most air forces reserved for specialized low-level training ranges. Night flying in the mountains, an exercise that terrified most pilots and that many air forces avoided entirely, was routine for the Swiss. They practiced air combat maneuvering in the narrow valleys where a single misjudgment could mean instant death against a granite wall, developing situational awareness and aircraft control that exceeded what most pilots ever achieved. They practiced emergency procedures relentlessly. Engine failure scenarios, hydraulic system malfunctions, electrical problems, every conceivable malfunction was rehearsed until responses became instinctive. This preparation saved lives. When emergencies occurred in actual operations, as they inevitably did over decades of demanding flying, Swiss pilots almost always brought their aircraft back safely, or, when that wasn't possible, ejected successfully because they'd practiced the procedures so many times. Remarkably, the accident rate in the Swiss Air Force was among the lowest in Europe, despite the dangerous nature of their training. This wasn't because they avoided risk. If anything, they embraced it more than most air forces, routinely flying in conditions and terrain that others would consider too dangerous. It was because they prepared for risk so thoroughly. Every contingency was planned for. Every emergency procedure rehearsed until it became instinct. Pilots knew exactly what to do in every situation, and more importantly, they knew exactly what not to do, which desperate maneuvers would kill you, and which might save you. The confidence of Swiss Mirage pilots was built on a foundation of experience accumulated over years and decades. Many had thousands of hours in the aircraft. It's far more than typical fighter pilots who might be transferred to different aircraft types or promoted to staff positions after a few tours. Swiss pilots could spend their entire careers flying the same valleys in the same aircraft type, accumulating depth of experience that simply wasn't possible in larger air forces with more diverse career paths. They had flown in every conceivable condition. Morning fog that filled valleys to the brim while peaks stood clear above. Afternoon thunderstorms that could destroy an aircraft with turbulence or hail. Winter snowstorms that reduced visibility to hundreds of meters. Summer heat that created thermal turbulence that tossed jets around like leaves. They had practiced every conceivable maneuver: high-altitude intercepts, low-level intercepts, night intercepts, intercepts in clouds using only instruments, intercepts of multiple targets, intercepts of fast targets, intercepts of slow targets. They had responded to every conceivable emergency. Engine failures, hydraulic failures, electrical failures, bird strikes, lost navigation equipment, radio failures, weather emergencies. This depth of experience was something that couldn't be taught in any classroom or manual. It had to be earned. One flight at a time, one emergency survived at a time, one mountain valley navigated successfully at a time, over years and then decades. November 1983, the night that never made the news. November 1983. NATO's Able Archer exercise simulated the outbreak of nuclear war. For 9 days, NATO forces practiced the procedures they would follow if World War III began. They moved forces, transmitted coded messages, simulated the deployment of nuclear weapons. Soviet intelligence believed it might be real. Their forces went to maximum alert. Soviet submarines moved into launch positions. Strategic bomber crews sat in their aircraft, engines running. In Moscow, some officials genuinely believed NATO was preparing a first strike under the cover of an exercise. The world came closer to nuclear war during Able Archer than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and most people never knew it happened. On the night of November 8th, an Antonov An-12 reconnaissance aircraft crossed into Swiss airspace at midnight. No transponder, no lights. Flying dark through the mountain passes, trying to intercept NATO communications during the exercise. The Swiss radar operator saw it instantly. Control, this is observation, post 7. I have an unidentified contact, bearing 045, altitude 3,000 meters, speed 400 knots. He just crossed the border. Copy that. 7. Stand by. 30 seconds of silence. Then scramble Falcon flight. Scramble, scramble, scramble. Two Mirages launched from their mountain airfield. Their pilot's call signs, Falcon 3 and Falcon 4, had been sitting cockpit alert for 6 hours straight. They knew the geopolitical situation. They knew that NATO and the Warsaw Pact were as close to war as they'd been in 2 decades. They also knew their orders: intercept any violation, regardless of circumstances. Falcon 3 was the flight lead that night. He had 2,400 hours in the Mirage and had flown the Alps for 16 years. He was about to need every bit of that experience. The intercept took place at night, in clouds, in narrow mountain valleys. Falcon 3 used only his radar, an instinct and the intimate knowledge of terrain he'd gained from thousands of hours flying these same valleys in every condition imaginable. 3 minutes, 59 seconds after scramble, he made radar contact. For minutes, 37 seconds after scramble, he achieved visual contact, emerging from clouds to find the Soviet An-12 in a valley so narrow there was barely room for both aircraft. He turned on his lights, slid into formation beside the Soviet aircraft, close enough that the Soviet crew could see him clearly. Close enough that there could be no doubt what was happening. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The Soviet aircraft continued on course, as if the pilot was trying to decide what to do: comply with the intercept, or press on with the mission. Falcon 3's hand moved to his weapon selector. If the An-12 didn't comply, he was authorized to fire. In normal times, that would mean a diplomatic incident. In these circumstances, it could mean the start of World War III. The Soviet aircraft turned, began following the Swiss interceptors toward Dubendorf. The crew landed at the Swiss airfield 40 minutes later. They were treated correctly, given food, allowed to rest, but held under guard, while Soviet and Swiss diplomats negotiated. The An-12 was returned 3 days later with its crew and equipment intact. After Swiss intelligence had thoroughly documented everything, no shots fired, no international incident. The world never knew how close it came. This was the Swiss way: professional, precise, utterly unwilling to let their neutrality be violated when the superpowers were playing with Armageddon. What happened to Falcon 3? He returned to routine duty, flew hundreds more sorties over the next decade, eventually retired without ever receiving public recognition for what he'd done that November night. When asked about it years later after the incident was declassified, he shrugged. "We did our job," he said. "That's what we trained for." The psychological burden of constant readiness should not be underestimated. Swiss Mirage pilots lived for decades with the knowledge that any scramble might be the start of World War III. They had to maintain peak performance despite this uncertainty. They had to be ready to take lives if ordered, to defend their country against overwhelming odds, to possibly sacrifice themselves in the process. Hans Müller, reflecting on his career after retirement, spoke about this burden. People see the aircraft, the speed, the excitement. They don't see the weight you carry. Every time you sit cockpit alert, you know that scramble order might mean the world is ending. You know you might have to kill someone, shoot down an aircraft full of people who got lost or made a navigation error. And you know that if war comes, we're a small country in the middle of a giant battlefield. We wouldn't last long. But we'd make them pay for every meter of Swiss territory. This burden forged bonds between pilots that lasted lifetimes. They understood each other in ways that outsiders couldn't fully grasp. They had shared something profound: the responsibility of defending their nation during the most dangerous period in human history. The Mirage II has served as the backbone of Swiss air defense for nearly 3 decades. From 1964 to 1999, an extraordinarily long service life for a military aircraft, especially a high-performance fighter that operated in demanding conditions. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, these aircraft maintained constant vigilance over Swiss skies, scrambling thousands of times, intercepting hundreds of intruders, demonstrating Swiss resolve day after day, year after year. Their pilots grew old in the service, accumulating thousands of hours that few fighter pilots and other air forces ever achieved. Some Swiss pilots spent their entire flying careers in the Mirage, mastering the aircraft to a degree that was only possible through such extended experience. They watched as technology evolved around them. Radars became more sophisticated. Missiles became more capable. Navigation systems transitioned from purely analog to early digital, but the fundamental mission remained unchanged: protect Swiss airspace, maintain neutrality, be ready to intercept any violation. The institutional memory was carefully preserved through multiple generations of pilots. Older pilots mentored younger ones, passing on techniques that couldn't be found in any manual or taught in any classroom. This transfer of expertise was formalized in training programs, but also happened informally in conversations after flights were experienced. Pilots would share insights about particular valleys or weather conditions. During briefings where lessons learned from recent intercepts were discussed, over drinks after long duty days, when the formal rank structure relaxed, and younger pilots could ask questions they might not ask officially. Senior pilots would tell stories about close calls, about intercepts that went perfectly, about weather that had been worse than expected, about intruders who had reacted in unexpected ways. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were essential education, passing along situational awareness and judgment that took decades to develop. A young pilot might hear about how visibility can suddenly drop to near zero in certain valleys when fog forms, or how certain intruders from certain nations tended to react in particular ways, or how instrument approaches to certain airfields required specific techniques in strong crosswinds. The result was a remarkably consistent level of capability maintained over decades, despite the constant turnover as pilots retired and new ones entered service. The Swiss Air Force had created a system that preserved knowledge and maintained standards across generations, ensuring that the force of 1995 was just as capable as the force of 1975, despite being composed of almost entirely different individuals. The mountains remained the same, eternal and unchanging, demanding respect from every pilot who ventured into their domain, regardless of experience level. Even pilots with thousands of hours treated every flight with appropriate seriousness, knowing that complacency in the Alps could be fatal. And Switzerland remained neutral throughout these decades, armed to the teeth, and absolutely serious about defending its sovereignty against any threat from any direction. By the late 1980s, the world was changing. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. The Cold War that had defined global politics for 4 decades ended not with the nuclear holocaust everyone had feared, but with a whimper of exhausted ideologies and bankrupt economies. The Mirage III was also showing its age. The aircraft that had been revolutionary in the 1960s was now outclassed by newer designs. The single-engine configuration that had once seemed adequate now posed risks that modern twin-engine designs avoided. Even navigation systems had improved dramatically. Accidental border violations were becoming less common. The Swiss began planning for a replacement. The evaluation process was as thorough as the original assessment that had selected the Mirage decades earlier. Swiss officials examined every available option, from the latest American designs to advanced European aircraft. They conducted extensive flight testing. They interviewed operators, analyzed maintenance and operating costs. The process took years. The replacement would eventually be the American FA-18 Hornet, a decision that sparked considerable controversy. Many Swiss citizens questioned whether buying an American aircraft was consistent with neutrality. The Hornet was, after all, a frontline fighter of the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. Others worried about the cost, which was substantial. In a country where major military spending required public referendums, this was politically significant. But the Swiss Air Force argued convincingly that they needed modern aircraft to maintain their deterrent capability. Threats had evolved. A credible air defense required equipment that could compete with the latest capabilities. The FA-18 ultimately won the competition. The transition from Mirage to Hornet was carefully managed. Swiss pilots trained on the new aircraft while maintaining proficiency on the old. Ground crews learned different maintenance requirements. Controllers adapted procedures to new capabilities. Throughout the transition, the Swiss maintained operational readiness. When the last Mirage IIs flew its final mission in 1999, it marked the end of an era. The ceremony at Dubendorf was a poignant affair. Pilots who had flown the aircraft for their entire careers gathered to say farewell. Ground crews who had maintained the machines for decades watched as they flew for the last time. Many had tears in their eyes. It was like saying goodbye to an old friend who had been part of their lives for 28 years. But the legacy lived on. The traditions of excellence, the obsession with reaction time, the determination to intercept any intruder, all of this continued with the new aircraft. Swiss FA-18 pilots maintained the same standards their Mirage flying predecessors had established. The 4-minute goal remained. The underlying philosophy hadn't changed. Swiss air defense depends on the ability to respond instantly to any threat. Foreign aviators who strayed into Swiss airspace in the 21st century found the response just as swift and professional as it had been during the Cold War. The aircraft had changed, but the mission had not. What made the Swiss Mirage force truly remarkable was not any single factor, but the combination of elements that came together to create an exceptionally effective defensive capability. The aircraft were excellent machines, well suited to their role. The pilots were superbly trained and deeply experienced, with skills honed in the most demanding environment imaginable. The support system's radar coverage, ground control, maintenance functioned with Swiss precision. Every element worked together as an integrated whole. And underlying everything was a national determination to maintain neutrality and sovereignty that had been cultivated over centuries. The Cold War is now history, studied in textbooks by generations who never lived with the fear of nuclear annihilation. But the lessons remain relevant. Small nations can defend themselves against great powers if they are sufficiently determined and well prepared. Technology alone is not decisive. What matters is how that technology is employed, and the willingness to treat all potential threats equally, showing no favoritism regardless of alliance or ideology, can be the foundation of credible neutrality. Other small nations have studied Swiss air defense as a model for their own capabilities. The Swiss demonstrated that size is not destiny, that a small country with limited resources can still maintain effective defense if sufficiently determined. This lesson has informed defense thinking around the world. The Swiss Mirage pilots embodied these principles throughout the Cold War. They flew their elegant delta-winged aircraft through mountain valleys, ready at any moment to respond to threats from any direction, intercepted intruders with speed and efficiency that astounded the best air forces in the world. And they maintained their professionalism through decades of tension, never knowing when a routine scramble might escalate into something far more dangerous. Those pilots are the heroes of this story, though they would be the last to describe themselves that way. They were simply doing their duty, protecting their country, maintaining its independence. They were Swiss, which meant they approached their task with precision, discipline, and understated pride. They didn't seek recognition or glory. They sought only to be ready, always ready to defend their homeland. The Swiss concept of duty informed everything these pilots did. In a country where military service was universal, where every citizen understood their responsibility to defend the nation, the role of the fighter pilot was simply the most visible expression of a shared commitment. In that brief span of time, less than 240-second Swiss Mirage, pilots could transform a violation of their airspace into a carefully controlled situation. They could launch from alert, climb to altitude, intercept the intruder, and establish visual contact. They could demonstrate beyond any doubt that Swiss neutrality was backed by genuine military capability. And they could do it all without firing a shot, simply by being present, by being professional, by being absolutely certain of their purpose. The Luftwaffe pilots who found themselves intercepted understood this perfectly. They had experienced in the most personal way possible the reality of Swiss air defense. They had seen the Mirages materialize from nowhere, watched the smooth precision with which Swiss pilots positioned their aircraft, followed the unmistakable gestures directing them to Swiss airfields. They had been stunned, yes, but they had also been impressed. Their accounts reveal grudging admiration for Swiss capabilities. Even pilots who resented being forced to land acknowledged the skill of their interceptors. Some formed friendships with Swiss pilots they later met at international gatherings. The shared experience of military aviation created bonds that transcended national boundaries. "We were intercepted in 4 minutes." That simple statement, repeated countless times by aviators of different nations over Cold War decades, encapsulated everything that made Swiss air defense exceptional. It spoke of preparation, of training, of determination. It acknowledged that the Swiss had created something remarkable in their mountain valleys, a defensive capability that commanded respect from even the most powerful air forces on Earth. The museum at Dubendorf keeps one Mirage eyes on display. Children press their faces against the protective rope, marveling at its sleek delta wing. Most visitors see an old airplane, a Cold War relic gathering dust behind velvet barriers. But on certain days, if you're there at the right time, you might see an elderly man standing before that aircraft, standing straighter than his years would suggest. He doesn't speak to anyone. He just looks at the cockpit, remembering. He remembers the weight of the helmet, the smell of jet fuel mixed with alpine air, the G-forces that pressed him into his seat during vertical climbs. He remembers the voice of the controller crackling in his headset. Falcon 2, you have an intruder? Scramble, scramble, scramble. He remembers the roar of the afterburner. The mountains blurring past his canopy, the moment he pulled alongside an aircraft whose crew had no idea they'd crossed into the wrong sky. He remembers the startled face of the other pilot, the instant recognition of what was happening, the immediate compliance. He remembers the debriefings, the diplomatic protests, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done his job exactly as trained. He remembers his squadron mates, some still alive, others long gone. He remembers the weight of responsibility they all carried, knowing that any scramble might be the start of World War III. Knowing they were the thin line defending Swiss independence, he remembers for minutes. The old pilot stands there a moment longer, then turns to leave. Outside, contrails streak across the same alpine sky he once defended. Different aircraft now, different pilots, same mission, same mountains, same Switzerland, and somewhere above. If you listen carefully on certain autumn days, when the wind blows just right through the valleys, you might hear the ghost of a Snecema engine still standing guard. The mountains still stand, the valleys still echo with memories. In the legend of the Swiss Mirage pilots lives Anna, reminder that small nations need not be weak, that neutrality need not be passive, and that for minutes can be enough to change history. This was the story of men who flew extraordinary machines in an extraordinary time, who defended their homeland without firing a shot in anger, and who earned the respect of aviators around the world through sheer skill and professionalism. They were Swiss, they were pilots, and they were among the best who ever flew. Their story deserves to be remembered. The Swiss borders remain the same, today carefully demarcated lines separating one of Europe's smallest nations from its larger neighbors. Aircraft still cross those borders occasionally, though modern navigation systems have made accidental violations far less common. But the principle remains unchanged. Violate Swiss airspace and you will face Swiss interceptors. Today those interceptors are FA-18 Hornets rather than Mirage II is. The pilots who fly them were trained in a tradition stretching back to those Cold War years. They maintain the same standards, aspire to the same reaction times, demonstrate the same quiet professionalism. The aircraft have changed, but the mission has not. The Luftwaffe crews who were intercepted by Swiss Mirage pilots would recognize that philosophy instantly. They experienced it at Mach 2, at close quarters. In the narrow valleys of the Alps, they learned that neutrality backed by capability is something to be taken very seriously indeed. For minutes. That was the Swiss standard, a standard that defined an era of air defense excellence. It was the time it took to transform a radar blip into an escorted violation. It was the measure of Swiss preparation and Swiss skill. And it was the reality that every pilot who flew near Swiss airspace had to respect. The story of the Swiss Mirage Force is ultimately a story about what a nation can accomplish when truly serious about its defense. It's not with the largest air force or the biggest budget, but with the right combination of determination, training, and equipment. The Swiss proved that quality can triumph over quantity, that preparation can overcome numerical disadvantage, that the will to defend can be the most powerful weapon of all. Those Luftwaffe crews understood this perfectly after their 4-minute education in Swiss air defense. They may have been stunned initially, but they left with profound respect for what the Swiss had achieved. They had witnessed firsthand the sharp edge of armed neutrality. It was sharper than they had ever imagined. The Cold War is over now, consigned to history books and military museums, but the lessons of that era remain relevant for any nation that values its independence. Be prepared. Be professional. Be ready to defend what you hold dear. Do it all with quiet competence that commands respect rather than demands it. The Swiss Mirage pilots exemplified these lessons throughout their service. They were not famous in the conventional sense. These men who flew through mountain valleys at supersonic speeds, they didn't seek publicity or recognition. They simply did their jobs day after day, year after year, protecting their country and maintaining its neutrality. They were the unseen guardians of Swiss independence, their presence a deterrent that helped keep the peace. And when called upon to intercept, they performed brilliantly, 4 minutes from scramble to interception. Every time, in all weather, against any intruder. It was a feat that amazed the aviation world and established a standard few other nations could match. It was the hallmark of Swiss air defense excellence. The last Mirages are gone now, retired to museums or sold to other nations. The pilots who flew them have moved on, their flying days behind them. But what they accomplished during those Cold War decades endures. They proved that a small nation could punch above its weight in air defense. They demonstrated that preparation and training could compensate for limited resources. They showed that neutrality, properly defended, could be viable even in an era of superpower confrontation. For minutes, the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee, the time it took Swiss Mirage pilots to intercept any aircraft that dared to violate their airspace, it sounds impossible, but they did it routinely. It sounds like legend. But it was documented reality. It sounds like exaggeration. But the pilots who were intercepted would testify otherwise. The Luftwaffe crews were stunned. So were French crews, American crews, and crews from nations on both sides of the Iron Curtain. They all discovered the same truth. Switzerland was small, but Switzerland was serious. Cross that border uninvited, and you would meet the sharp edge of Swiss neutrality. In less than 240 seconds, that is perhaps the most important legacy of the Swiss Mirage force. Not the aircraft themselves, remarkable as they were, not the individual intercepts, dramatic as they could be. But the demonstration repeated countless times over Cold War decades that neutrality backed by capability is something to be respected. The mountains still guard Switzerland as they have for millennia. The valleys still wind through the Alps, challenging any pilot who ventures through them. And the spirit of the Mirage pilots still lives on in the men and women who now defend Swiss airspace with modern aircraft. They carry a proud tradition, a legacy of excellence forged in those formidable intercepts. Switzerland remains neutral as it has been for centuries. It remains well defended as it has always been. It remains ready to protect its independence against any threat. Just as the Mirage pilots were ready throughout the Cold War, some things change. But the fundamental principles endure. For minutes, that was the Swiss way. Fast, precise, professional, and absolutely uncompromising. It was enough to stun Luftwaffe crews, to impress military aviators worldwide, and to secure Swiss sovereignty through decades of global tension. It was the measure of Swiss excellence in the air. And somewhere in the memories of those who experienced it and the records of those who documented it, that 4-minute standard lives on. A reminder of what once was. A benchmark of what is possible. And an inspiration for what can still be achieved when a nation is truly serious about its defense. The Swiss Mirage pilots would probably shrug off such praise. They were simply doing their jobs. They would say, just maintaining readiness, just protecting the homeland, just being Swiss. But the Luftwaffe crews knew better. They knew that what they had experienced was something special, something remarkable, something worthy of the stunned admiration they freely admitted. They had been intercepted by the best, and they knew it. For minutes, the time that defined an era of Swiss air defense. The standard that amazed the world, the legacy that endures to this day. The story of the Swiss Mirage pilots is complete. But their legend lives on. In the mountains they defended. In the respect they earned from aviators around the world. They flew with skill, served with honor, and protected their homeland with a dedication that commands admiration. We were intercepted in 4 minutes. Those words, spoken by stunned Luftwaffe crews throughout the Cold War, remain the ultimate tribute to what the Swiss Mirage force achieved. They encapsulate everything that made Swiss air defense exceptional, everything that made those pilots legendary, and everything that makes this story worth telling. The Cold War ended, but the story endures. The Mirages are gone, but the memory lives on. And somewhere in the Swiss Alps, the spirit of those remarkable pilots still soars, forever vigilant, forever ready, forever Swiss.